The snow had turned to needles against her skin, fine wind-hardened shards that sliced through the wool of her shawl and stuck to the wet lashes around her eyes. Her skirt was heavy with ice. The hem dragged behind her like a broken wing as she stumbled across the barren stretch of land, the child pressed to her chest, not stirring. The boy walked just behind, not speaking. His mittens were soaked stiff as bark, and his small boots left a jagged trail beside her own. Each step was a quiet prayer that the next would not be the one where she fell and did not rise. The silence of the plains made her feel that God had stopped listening long ago. She had not seen smoke for miles. No trees, no fences, no road. Only the land, white and cruel beneath the pale weight of a dying sky. Her legs gave out before her mind did, and she crumpled into the snow, clutching the baby tighter, her breath jerking in short, hot bursts. "Mama," the boy said, the first sound in hours. She tried to speak, but her lips had split. A thin thread of blood traced the corner of her mouth. Her hand reached blindly for him, touched the rough wool of his coat. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. The wind didn't stop to notice. Far off, past the low roll of the hill, a rider came into view. He was just a shape at first, blurred, slow-moving, as if the land itself had conjured him. A lone figure on a paint horse headed east. He would have missed them entirely had the boy not started waving with the last of his strength, stumbling into the open arms, flapping like a rag caught in the wind. The cowboy pulled the reins hard. The horse tossed its head, snorting steam, and then turned. He was off the saddle before it had stopped moving, boots crunching through the snow as he dropped to one knee beside the woman. His gloved hand touched her neck, checking. Then her cheek. She didn't flinch. The baby was still alive, barely. A girl, he thought, though she was wrapped so tight in a torn quilt it was hard to tell. The mother's body had curled protectively around her, even in collapse. Snow had begun to pile along her spine. "Let me take her," he said, low, steady. The boy nodded, but didn't speak. The cowboy worked quickly, lifting the child and wrapping her in his coat. He picked up the boy next, carried him under one arm like a sack of flour, and bent to get the woman last. She didn't weigh more than a deer carcass. Bones and cloth and quiet. He walked the three of them back to his horse, muttering to the gelding as he arranged them best he could across the saddle. He did not ask their names. That would come later, if it came at all. The wind picked up as he turned west, reins in hand, walking alongside the horse to spare its strength. The cabin was a good hour away, maybe more in this snow. But he had brought worse things home. Behind them, the land swallowed the shape of her footprints. By morning there would be no sign she had ever come this far. The fire had nearly died by the time he pushed open the cabin door with his shoulder. Inside, the cold clung to the walls like mold. He kicked the door shut behind him and went straight to the hearth, dumping the bundled child onto a fur throw and setting the boy down beside her. Then he laid the woman out gently on the floor. The boy just stood there, shaking, fists clenched at his sides. "Sit," the cowboy said, not unkindly. "You're safe now." He peeled off his gloves, then his coat, and went to work. He shoveled dry kindling into the hearth with the efficiency of a man who lived on borrowed time. Within minutes the fire roared back to life, crackling and spitting sap. He brought out blankets, water from the stove, warmed kettle, and a jar of tallow to rub into the woman's stiff fingers. Her skin was near translucent, cheeks hollow, lips a raw, shivering blue. She coughed once, shallow and sharp, then again deeper, and her eyes opened. "Easy now," he said, crouching beside her. She blinked slowly. The flickering light painted the room golden shadow. Her gaze darted to the baby, then to the boy. Relief twisted across her face before she dropped her head back to the floor, eyes shut. "You're all right." "They're all right," he said. Her lips moved, forming no sound. He didn't ask what happened. He could already see the truth etched into the lines around her mouth, the raw cracks in her hands, the bite of hunger in the child's ribs. She was someone left behind. He moved the kettle closer to the fire and poured warm water into a cup, added a pinch of dried herbs from the jar by the stove. The smell of chamomile and mint filled the air, softening the edges of the cold. He pressed it into her hands. "Drink this." She tried, failed. He steadied the cup for her. The baby stirred under the quilt, let out a weak, mewling cry. The boy moved to her quickly, touching her cheek with trembling fingers. "Cora," he said softly. "It's all right." The cowboy sat back on his heels and watched. The woman sipped again, more this time. Her eyes met his, pale green with a storm of grief just beneath. She nodded, the gesture barely visible. He tipped his hat. "You're safe here. Don't have much, but the walls hold." She opened her mouth. Voice rasped. Where are we?" "My place. Half day from Dalton's Creek. I'm just a ranch hand. Cabin was my father's." The boy looked up. "You live here all alone." "Seems so," he said. "Till today." He stood, moved to the cupboard. "You hungry?" The boy didn't answer, but the way he stared at the tin of beans the man pulled down said plenty. Within the hour, the small room was thick with the scent of warmth and food. The woman had propped herself against the wall, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. She hadn't spoken again, but she watched the man with wary eyes, as if waiting for some change, some unkind truth to show itself. But the cowboy said little. He handed them bowls and took his own to the far corner. "Let them eat first." The baby suckled at a tin cup of milk with trembling lips. The boy's eyes didn't leave her. When the quiet came full and warm, the cowboy said, "Storm's not letting up soon. You'll stay as long as you need." The woman looked down. Her fingers curled around the bowl. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't nod, didn't smile. He just stirred the fire once more and said, "Reckon we all need saving now and then." The trail calls again. Subscribe and answer. Morning came soft and gray, wrapped in silence. The storm had passed in the night, but the snow still blanketed the land thick and high, like a secret meant to stay buried. The world outside the cabin looked untouched, as if no one had ever walked there, as if her collapse had been swallowed up by mercy or forgetting. The woman woke slowly, still propped against the wall, her head resting on a folded quilt. Her neck ached and her ribs felt tight from coughing. But there was heat in the room and a smell of wood smoke that made her eyes burn with something close to gratitude. The baby Cora lay asleep in a little crate padded with wool and sheepskin, her face pink and soft. The boy sat beside her, brushing back her hair with careful fingers, murmuring nonsense under his breath. He looked up when their mother stirred. "You didn't die," he said quietly. She tried to smile. "Not yet." The cowboy was already up. He'd been outside early, judging by the snow melting in patches on his shoulders. He set down an armful of firewood, clapped the snow from his gloves, and looked over at her without speaking. She cleared her throat. "I don't know your name." "Ellie," he said. "Eli Walker." She nodded, then, after a pause, said, "My name's Ruth." He waited. She rubbed a thumb over her lip. "That's James. He's 6. The baby's Cora. She's not yet 2. Rough time for travel," Eli said, setting another log on the fire. She laughed once, short and dry. "Weren't meant to be traveling." He didn't press, just waited. "My husband left us in a house near Bethel," she said, her voice flat. "Said he was going for work. Never came back. Winter hit and the food ran out. The stove broke and the man who owned the land came to collect. Said we could stay or leave, but staying cost more than I had." Eli listened without blinking. "I thought there'd be a town to the west," she said. "Heard of one with a church. Didn't know it was so far. We walked, I don't know how long." Eli stood and poured her a cup of hot water. No herbs this time, just warmth. She took it with both hands. "You could have ridden on," she said. "You didn't have to stop." He shrugged. "Didn't seem right leaving you there." That was all. The boy James piped up, "Are we gonna stay here?" Ellie didn't answer right away. He looked at the child, then at Ruth. Her face had the drawn look of someone ready to be turned out again, ready to be told it was only for the night, only until the weather cleared. "You'll stay," he said simply. "Cabin's got room, and I got more food than I can eat. You help out where you can." Ruth's throat tightened. She swallowed hard. "We'll pull our weight." "I know." Later, Eli took James with him to the barn to tend the horses and check the traps. Ruth watched from the window as her son walked beside him in boots too big, holding a feed bucket with both hands. She pressed her fingers to the pane. The frost melted under her touch, leaving a trail like a tear down the glass. Inside, the cabin smelled of ash and stew, the kind of scent that stayed in your clothes, in your hair, the kind of scent you remembered when everything else had gone. She picked up the baby, kissed her cheek, and whispered something no one else heard. Outside, the sun broke through for the first time in days, pale and cold but promising. By the end of that first week, the rhythm of the place had settled into her bones. Mornings began early. The baby woke hungry, her small cries barely cutting through the thick quiet of dawn. Ruth would wrap herself in a wool coat that smelled of smoke and milk and tiptoe to the fire to warm a cloth with snowmelt for Cora. The girl drank greedily, her eyes half-lidded and grateful. Eli rose with the sun already pulling on his boots by the time Ruth stirred. He spoke little in the mornings, nodded, poured coffee, stepped out into the cold with a purposeful kind of silence. But he left the cabin door cracked just long enough to let in the air, and Ruth could smell the sharp scent of frost and horses before it swung closed again. James had taken to following Eli like a shadow. At first the boy watched from a distance, half curious, half cautious, but by the third morning he was helping feed the livestock, learning the names of tools, even asking questions. Eli answered them in quiet, practical tones, never patronizing, never soft. It seemed to steady the boy in ways Ruth couldn't. In the evening she cooked. Nothing fancy, beans, cornbread, dried apples when she had the nerve to ask for them. Eli always ate what she made without complaint, offered a low thanks, then returned to his carving or mending in the corner by the fire. One night, while James and Cora slept, Ruth sat near the hearth, patching the hem of her skirt. The thread was too thick, the needle dull, but her hands remembered how to work. Eli looked up from his whittling. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" "My mother," she said, "taught me when I was just little. Said I'd need to know when I married." "Did you?" Ruth paused, knotting the thread. Not in the way she meant. He didn't answer, just kept shaving curls of wood from the handle of a tool he was shaping. The firelight painted his features in amber. He looked younger when he was quiet. She found herself watching him longer than she meant to. "You build all this?" she asked, nodding toward the cabin walls. "My father built most of it," he said. "I was young then. After he passed, I added on some, reinforced the roof, rebuilt the barn when the wind took it." "Is it just yours now?" He nodded. No one else left to claim it. She waited, sensing the door he hadn't opened yet. But he didn't say more. Still, something about the way he looked at the fire that night told her there were ghosts here too. Not just hers. The next day she followed James and Eli out to the barn. The cold hit hard, slicing through her coat, but she bore it. She wanted to understand the land, the labor that seemed to center Eli's life. She watched him work, his sure hands, the way he moved like he knew every board and beam. He gave her no instruction, just handed her a pitchfork and nodded toward the hay. She set to it, stumbling at first, coughing into her sleeve from the dust but not stopping. Sweat broke along her spine under the layers of cloth. The ache in her shoulders was honest and familiar. Later she leaned against the fence and let the sun hit her face. Cora dozed nearby in a bundled basket of furs, and James chased the barn cat across the hard-packed snow. Eli stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the horse paw at the trough. "You've got grit," he said. She didn't look at him, just smiled faintly. "Didn't know I had it. Not till now." They stood like that a while, not speaking, the silence between them no longer sharp but solid, like something that could be built on. The days lengthened just barely in that way. They did near the end of January, soft hints of change that didn't promise warmth, only time. Ruth had stopped counting mornings. Instead, she measured by what had returned the weight of her child against her hip, the sound of James laughing again, the calluses building back up on her palms. She didn't ask Eli how long they could stay, and he didn't say. It was as though the question had been buried under the snow with everything else that once mattered. One afternoon she found him splitting wood behind the barn sleeves, rolled steam rising off his skin with each swing of the axe. The wind had dropped that morning, and though the air was still bitter, there was a kind of peace to the cold. No storm behind it. No threat. Just winter doing what winter did. She stood nearby, holding a basket of laundry she'd just brought in from the line, half frozen. "You always work alone." Eli paused, set the axe down, wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Used to have a brother," he said. "Jacob. Younger than me. Left for Missouri 6 years back. Haven't heard from him since the war broke out down there." Ruth shifted the basket against her hip. "That's a long silence." Eli looked out past the trees. "Not uncommon." She waited, not pushing, just letting the quiet settle. "My ma died the same winter he left," he said. "Pa not long after. Been just me and this place ever since." Ruth nodded, eyes on the woodpile. "I always figured there'd be someone, a neighbor, a preacher, anyone, but there wasn't. Just me and the children and a house full of nothing." Eli's eyes flicked toward her, then down. "You held on longer than most would." She laughed, short and humorless. "I didn't have the option not to." Eli leaned against the chopping block, arms folded. "I reckon that's the difference between grit and pride. One keeps you breathing. The other'll bury you." They stood in that stillness, no sound but the wind threading through the pines and the creak of the barn door behind them. That night Ruth found a bundle beside her side of the hearth, a new needle, sharper and clean, tucked into a small square of linen. No note. No explanation. She smiled. Over the following days their lives braided together without force. Ruth began tending the cabin as if it were hers, patching leaks, cleaning out old drawers, boiling lye soap on the back stove. Eli showed James how to oil the saddle and taught Ruth how to check the traps along the north edge of the woods. She wasn't quick to learn, but she didn't flinch when she had to kill a rabbit. Ellie noticed. One evening Ruth stood over the fire, stirring a pot of stew with her sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from the heat. Cora was asleep in her lap, wrapped snug against her belly with a worn scarf. "You ever think of leaving this place?" she asked. Eli didn't answer right away. He was sitting at the table, mending a leather strap with quiet focus. "Used to," he said. "Thought I'd head west. Maybe find work on the river. But the land holds you if you let it. Not always gentle, but sure." Ruth nodded slowly. "I feel that. Like the place sees you, even when nobody else does." Eli looked up. His gaze held hers steady and plain. "You've been seen." Her breath caught. Not from surprise. From truth. She turned back to the stew, blinking hard. The wind outside had gone still. The whole world, for one small hour, seemed to be listening. The thaw came late that year. March rolled in gray and reluctant, dragging its heels across the valley. Snow melted slow and stubborn, pooling in the low places, turning the yard to muck. The trees remained bare, their branches rattling like bones in the wind. But the mornings weren't so bitter, and the sun started lingering a little longer each day, stretching shadows across the porch. Inside the cabin, life pressed forward with quiet insistence. Ruth hung laundry out again, even when it froze stiff before drying. James had learned how to split kindling without cutting himself, and Eli started letting him tend the fire. Cora could crawl now, fast, strong, and more than once Ruth caught her dragging herself toward the open door like she meant to cross the whole prairie. Eli had built a pen to keep her safe, padded it with sheepskin and old flour sacks. He never said a word about it, just set it by the fire and nodded once when Ruth saw it. One evening Ruth sat outside on the step, her arms wrapped around her knees. The air smelled of wet pine and distant smoke. She could hear James in the barn, his voice rising and falling in some made-up song, and Cora laughing from inside as Eli bounced her gently on his knee. The sound of it all settled in her chest, strange and full. Ellie came out and sat beside her, not speaking. They watched the moon rise together, pale and slow, over the tree line. "I used to think peace would feel like silence," she said. "But it's more like the absence of fear." Eli rubbed his palms together, stared out at the dark. "Most folks don't know what to do when the fear's gone. They wait for it to come back, like they don't trust the stillness. I've lived in fear so long," she whispered, "I didn't know I could be anything else." Eli looked at her, then full on. "You've changed," he said. She blinked. "Into what?" He shrugged. "Into someone who looks ahead, not just behind." She wanted to believe that. Later that night, Ruth found herself lying awake, staring at the rafters. Cora slept curled into her side, James across the room in the old cot. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. She listened for Eli's footsteps, for the creak of the porch, but the cabin stayed still. She wondered what he dreamed about, if he dreamed at all. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. It wasn't sudden. No declarations, no blushes, no stolen glances. Just smaller things. The way Eli waited for her to speak when she was quiet. The way he handed her coffee in the morning before taking his own. How his voice softened when talking to James. How Ruth let her hand linger on his sleeve a second longer when passing by. Trust, slow built and real, had turned to something warmer. Something neither of them named. Until one night, when the lantern burned low and the snow was nearly gone, Ruth stood at the window and said quietly, if we stayed, would that be all right?" Eli didn't answer at first. He stood behind her, his presence calm, grounded. Then, just above a whisper, "I was hoping you might." She turned to him. His hand found hers. Nothing more. No urgency. Just the quiet certainty of two people who had already walked through fire, and now finally had someone to stand beside. Spring came all at once, as it sometimes does on the frontier. One day the trees were bare, and the next green tips unfurled from the branches like the land had remembered it was alive. The creek behind the cabin, which had been frozen solid since November, rushed high and fast with snowmelt. Frogs returned. Birds nested in the eaves. James picked wild onion from the woods and brought it home in a muddy handkerchief. Cora babbled her first clear word, "Ma," while Ruth was bent over a pot of boiling wash, her hands raw and wet, her heart stopping just long enough to make her dizzy. Eli fixed the roof over the root cellar, then started digging a proper garden bed. He didn't say it outright, but he laid out extra rows. One morning Ruth joined him outside, wiping her hands on her skirt. She'd just finished hanging a fresh line of linens, and her hair had come loose in the breeze. "You planting squash?" she asked, squinting down at the furrows he was carving. "Squash? Potatoes? Onions. Figured we'd try corn this year." She caught the "we." He didn't look at her when he said it. but she felt the weight of the word settle between them like a hand resting lightly on her back. That night James sat on the porch steps with Cora in his lap, showing her stars as they came out. Ruth leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Eli stood beside her, close enough their shoulders brushed. "You ever think about marriage again?" he asked quietly. She didn't look at him. "Not at first. I did once," she said. "And then I stopped. Stopped dreaming about anything except getting through the day." His voice was careful. "And now?" She glanced at him, caught his expression in the half-light. There was no push in it, no hunger, just the steady presence of a man who had offered shelter and asked nothing in return. "I don't want what I had before," she said. "I won't be a shadow in someone else's life." Eli nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to." They stood quiet a long while. The air smelled of dirt and pine sap. Somewhere down in the creek a bird trilled once, then went still. "You'd have a say in everything," he said at last. "In the land, the house, the future. I won't ever leave you wondering where I went." She looked at him then. "Let's not do it for the name," she said. "Let's do it for the home." Eli smiled, not wide, not showy, just the kind of smile that said something inside him had finally settled. "All right," he said. "For the home." Weeks later they said vows on the porch with James holding Cora in his arms and the spring wind tossing Ruth's hair across her eyes. There was no preacher, no ring, just hands held, eyes met, and words spoken clear and honest into the open air. Ruth planted the first row of corn herself that evening, her bare hands in the warm earth, her back aching, her chest full. Cora sat nearby with a carved wooden bird in her lap, a gift from Eli. James chased a moth across the garden path. Behind them the cabin stood tall and solid against the coming dusk. They were no longer visitors here. They were home. Do not leave this road alone. Subscribe and walk it with us step by step.